Hi, my name is Indranil Chakraborty and I'm the founder of StoryWorks, a firm completely focused exclusively on the use of stories in business. It's been a while since the last video, and that's because I've been traveling, delivering a few programs on business storytelling, and working on a very exciting project for a bank which is repositioning itself. And we've created the narrative that the senior leadership of that bank would be using to explain this repositioning to their own employees. Now, coming back to what we've been talking about the various uses of stories in business. In the last video, we talked about how stories inspire action. In today's video, we're going to talk about how stories can help us make sense of complexity. And in order to do that, we will talk about the Cynefin framework, or spelled Cynefin. It's a framework to understand complexity and uncertainty, designed by Snowden and published in the Harvard Business Review in 2007. And this model of complexity has four quadrants. The bottom right hand quadrant is called the simple domain. And this is where the cause and effect relationship is very well known. If you do X, you will always get Y. No matter how many times you do it, you always get the same answer. For example, a salad recipe. You follow the steps and you always get the same result. In this domain, the sort of things that work for you are standard operating procedures, best practices. You end up knowing that you will have one or a few good answers. The next domain is the complicated domain. Again, another domain like the simple domain, which we are really good at. The complicated domain, the relationships between cause and effect are there, but you've got to put some effort into working out the relationship. You've got to do some analysis and work out what some of the possibilities are. There is multiple possibilities for the same effect. So this domain is really about the analysis, about the expert mindset. It is about people putting in that effort. It is about left brain stuff, rational, linear, data-based logic. Let me give you an example. Imagine that an aircraft is stalled on the runway. Now, the reason why it is stalled could be many. It could be mechanical, electrical, fuel. We don't know. We need an expert to diagnose the problem and using data and come up with a reason why this must have happened. And let's say he figures out that it is an electrical problem and a fuse is blown. Then it has now become suddenly a simple problem. And any engineer who understands the fuse can go and put it in and it'll work. The area that really interests us is in this next domain, the complex domain, in the top left-hand corner. This is where the cause and effect relationship is so intertwined that things only make sense in hindsight. In the complex space, things are unpredictable in detail, and the way you make progress in the complex space is to sense the patterns that are there. The sort of things you're dealing with here in the complex space are things like culture, innovation, leadership, trust, all these messy people things. In a government situation, it could be the economy, environment, homelessness, etc., where there's no one single correct answer. The thing is that in many organizations, we have been dealing with these messy people issues as if they were either simple or complicated. Using that mindset and approach, now when you start recognizing them as complex, you can start using different tools, different ways, and different ways of understanding the same problem, different ways to make sense. And this is where stories are very important, because stories help you see patterns, see the messiness that is going on in organizations. Now let me give you an example. All of us in our organizations have at some time or the other done employee engagement survey. And then the way it usually happens in organizations that I've worked with or worked for is when the results come out, the senior people look at the results, look at where the scores are low and where the scores are low and the area is important. The next thing in most organizations is to create a cross-functional team. And I have been in many of them. The problem with that approach is, what does the cross-functional team do first? Since you can't go about doing a fact-finding mission without hypothesis, you first build hypothesis. So imagine I'm the leader of a cross-functional team, and let's imagine the problem. Let's say the organization has got a low score in fairness in appraisal. All organizations get a low score in fairness in appraisals. Now, Let's say I'm the cross-functional team and I've been given the mandate to go and find out why did the employees give a low score in fairness and appraisal, and what can we do next year to make sure we don't get the low score. Now I sit with my cross-functional team and I have to come up with hypothesis. Now the first issue is my hypothesis generation is limited to the limited understanding me and my team have. And in all likelihood, the kind of hypothesis we come out with is probably because we used a bell curve and bell curve is unfair, or because of recency. We are doing a Jan-December appraisal sometime in April, and something that we did in February is impacting the appraisal, etc., etc. Now, that's one of the lacuna, which is hypothesis generated based on only my and my team's understanding. The next thing we do is to take this survey externally to other employees. Now, if we use a quantitative approach, then there is no way we can get any other information. But even when we use a qualitative approach, usually no other information is recorded other than the hypothesis. Why does that happen? Because of something called confirmation bias. If I have hypothesis A and B and I'm going to test whether either or both of them are right or wrong, and I go to someone in a qualitative situation and they say B and C, guess what I've heard? B, because C was never part of my hypothesis. Now that's the second problem. The third problem is when I come back and present to the senior management, what am I presenting? A bunch of opinions. Even if I've met 500 people, I've got a bunch of opinions. Yeah. And let's say I come back to the senior management and say that 80% of the employees believe that the bell curve is unfair. So I think next year, if we find a new way of appraisal other than the bell curve, we would get better results. And the CEO looks at me and says, you know what? I don't think the bell curve is a problem. I think the communication about the bell curve was a problem. I think this year we should communicate better what the bell curve is about, and we'll not have a problem. What just happened? An opinion of a leader argued with an opinion of the rest of the employees. Opinions can always be argued with, and an opinion of a senior person is probably going to prevail. Now, this is a complex problem of fairness in appraisal. How do you try and solve it using simple and complicated methods? It'll never work. Simple and complicated methods work, as I mentioned earlier, in situations of machines, in situations of, let's say, market share or stuff like that. Now, a different way to approach this same problem is to make sense using stories. Let me explain. If we were given this problem of trying to find out why this company employees had given a low score in fairness and appraisal, and then make sense of this and then use that sense making to design intervention, this is how we would go about it. We would first go and collect stories about appraisals, about fairness and appraisal. And in order to do that, we would run something we call Anecdote Circles. Anecdote Circles are nothing but group discussions designed to elicit stories. Of course, you can't elicit stories by saying, tell me a story. So we have a way of eliciting stories, and we'll talk about that in some other video. But now, having collected those stories, we come and put up those stories on a wall and call the senior management who can take decisions. And the first 1 hour or so in this sort of workshop called Sense Making and Intervention Design, we ask the leaders to read the stories in silence. We give them a pad and a pen and just read the stories in silence. And I can almost hear the proverbial penny drop. Because, when you are looking and reading a story, you can't argue with it. You can just take it in. And what we are telling the leaders to do is to see if they can sense any patterns emerging in the stories we've collected. So let me give you an example. Suppose in this problem of fairness and appraisal, we found a story we found a collection of stories which went something on these lines, where someone said, I don't think appraisals in this company are fair. Last year, when my appraisal was being done, my boss answered a few SMSs. Once his laptop pinged and he said, this is important, let me just answer this. And towards the end of the appraisal, he waved at someone and said, hey, get me coffee, I'll just come. I think it's just a sham. It's just a tick mark exercise. Now, if you've got a pattern of stories like this, then perhaps you would make a better judgment of what to do. You'd probably say, okay, let's teach active listening or empathetic listening to the people who will be appraising. You might say that let's create a zone where appraisals will be done, where people can't go in with their smart devices. And clearly, when the leaders are reading these stories, they can't argue with those stories. And this makes sure that we are really attacking the right problem rather than saying, let's do the communication of the bell curve much better. Now, coming to the last quadrant of the complexity sort of diagram that I talked about, the last quadrant is called the chaotic quadrant. This is where none of the other ways of making sense or analysis or problem solving can work. What you do in a chaotic situation is you just act. Any action, you just act and put this problem into one of the other quadrants and then look at how you can analyze. Think New York 9/11. One plane has gone into the tower, the second plane is coming in. You're not going to be sitting and saying, okay, why do you think this happened, or try and make sense. You just act. You call the army, call the fire brigade, tell the air force to ground all planes, etc. And once you've taken action and you've pushed each of these problems into the other quadrants, you then see what analysis you can do. So this is one way that stories can be used in business in order to understand the messiness of the people issues in an organization. Thank you for listening. At the end of this video, you'll again get the contacts, the email IDs, the Twitter handles, and do get in touch with us if you want to know more.